Buonasera. My name is Paolo Barlera. I'm the interim director of the Italian Cultural Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you here tonight for an evening devoted to architecture. We actually have a fireplace, so we could have a fireside chat in this very rainy evening. Anyway, architecture is one of the fields that in which Italy has excelled throughout the centuries. But tonight we are particularly proud to host an event that does not deal with historical achievements, but with contemporary issues and on what Italian thinkers and architects are doing in collaboration with their global counterparts. We have a long list of speakers, and so I'm not going to waste to take more of your time, and I'm going to leave the microphone to the organizer and coordinator of this event and the project, Davide Ruzzon.
Thanks very much. But before to begin my speech, my short speech, I would like to invite Adolfo Suarez of Lombardini 22 to conclude the institutional presentation of the. Yes, you speak inside the microphone to record better. To record, if I'm able.
Okay, hello. Thank you to the Italian Institute to invite us to be here today. We are very proud to be in New York to present the Intertwining. I am representing here Lombardini 22. We are a design company, and we believe on excellence on design. We do only retail, commercial buildings, hospitality, and branding. There is a lot of things that we don't know, and we think that what David is working on is understanding the relationship between the neuroscience and the architecture can help us to convince our clients that there is something that makes sense and can help really to understand the relationship between the space and the human beings. And this can, at the end, can be good, let's say, for our clients, and that's at the end also for us. So that's why we are trying to somehow promote intertwining, because it's like a voice to those new things that they are happening. So I think that David has done a huge job in terms of putting together the neuroscience and the architecture, because it's something new, and it's something new that somehow David is developing, and somehow intertwining is like a voice for all those new things that they are having. So I'm very happy to introduce the event, because I think that we need to talk about these things, these new things, because it's really a new thing, and it's something that is worthy to be diffused. Thank you very much. Thank you, David.
And now I want to ask to Sarah. I'm asking Sarah to stay with us. To Sarah Robinson, I want to introduce you.
Well, thanks for
few
coming.
words.
Thanks, Davide.
I can stop here.
Okay. So I'm just going to tell a little bit about why we did this journal. And Alessandro, my co-editor, and Davide and I are sick and tired of thinking of architecture as an object and form as a noun rather than a verb. And we want to explore architectural experience, the experience of making architecture as well. So we started this because we want to explore how where we end and where the world begins is an open question. And the person who who the title is an homage to is Merleau-Ponty, who dedicated his career to exploring exactly this. And the fourth chapter of his final manuscript, The Visible and the Invisible, is named Intertwining the Chiasm. And there he specifically looks at the reversibility of human sensibility, how when we touch, we're also touched, how when we see, we're also seen. And we think this is the heart of what architectural experience is. So he was also emphatic that no one discipline is going to have the last word on this complex life process. So we wanted to create a place where multiple disciplines can come together and have multiple ways of knowing. For example, we have poetry, we have art, we have philosophy, we also have neuroscience. But no one has a truth claim higher than any other. So that's what we wanted to do. And we are so happy that you've come here, but also contributed. So I'm not going to take any more of your time. Davide.
Well, thanks, Sarah. I want to continue this first introduction related to the whole frame we designed to start and to develop this new project, learning and research project called Intertwining. I would add that intertwining is also a sort of depth we found toward one of the first books wrote by Stephen Holl, because intertwining is also one of the titles of his very first books. And but coming back to this kind of work, this issue of Intertwining Magazine, the book we are presenting in this moment about culture, I want only to very rapidly focus the keys to understand for which reason we decide to focus the idea, the research of this issue on culture. And last year in Davos, some group of people, the culture minister of the European countries, decided to claim that we need to come back to the culture interlacing of architecture and not thinking, but exactly the culture. So the Bau culture was claimed directly after that statement. But for which reason we decide to focus, I repeat, our research in this field, and this name, Bau culture? Because as later you are going to understand better, thanks to Douglas' speech, I don't describe your teams, because also my daughter had me when I tried to spoiler the film I saw, so I don't want to spoiler your intervention. And but I want to mention anyway your works, because in your article you define as the artificial shape has been fundamental for the cognition development. Architectural as artificial environment, the artificial shape of the environment has been crucial, fundamental for the mind evolution. In a particular moment of the history evolution, we are speaking about the 11,000 years before Christ, as a particular moment of the evolution, and in which after that the cognition increasingly gain new process, gain new rapidity of evolutions, and architecture has been in that moment a trigger a booster, a very important booster of this evolution. So it seems emerging clearly by the research that you mentioned, Douglas mentioned in his book, and then we assume that one of the points of starting of this research of this book. But after that, what means this? You have to take account that the brain plasticity is being demonstrated through this research, because after 2 million years from the Erectus to the Sapiens, humans developed few abilities, we could say. But after that moment, the Neolithic Revolution, in few millennia, the cognitive capabilities of humans developed enormously. And this is the point in which is being fixed the first architecture, the first architecture devoted to elaborate the rituals. The first space devoted to elaborate and to repeat a ritual is being found out close to the border of Syria, in the south of Turkey. And we think this is a very important discovery. This is a very important discovery, demonstrating that the plasticity of the brain is true. We didn't know. We didn't need to have also this historical demonstration of the plasticity of the brain, surely, because the plasticity of the brain demonstrated from a lot of evidence, of different evidence. But the possibility to recognize in the appearance of the first architecture the trigger of this kind of cognitive evolution has been very important. And after that, a question emerged rapidly, because if it's true, we have to ask to ourselves, as the new dimension of the environment, the artificial environment that we are going to live, and next generation are going to live in the next decades or the next century, could affect deeply the cognitive evolutions, but in which direction? This is the question. Because if architecture has been so important to trigger the positive evolution, a different kind of environment, so artificial environment, in which way could affect the evolution or involution of the cognitive humans? So architecture is not neutral. It's not a neutral place. And Bauculture is the attempt to gain attention of the social dimension, the political dimension, the economic dimension, the industry attention, to this important relationship among humans and environment, because the relationship, the experience of the space is not neutral. Respect our capacity to maintain the humanity of humans in the next generation. Obviously, architecture cannot do everything, cannot solve social and economical problem, because we are not so to think like this, but we have to understand, we have to recognize that architecture produced a very important revolution, so-called the Neolithic Revolution in that period. And so it's a very, very, it's hugely important also for us to gain it, to maintain this position, to give a look deeply to this situation. And I want to stop here, and because I spoke about this content, inside the magazine there's a lot. There are many other articles and many other ways to then demonstrate, to describe, because inside, as we are going to see, there's also the publication of some projects that, from our point of view, are the expression, this attempt, this attention, this level. There's articles and interviews. There's the attempt to focus the problem. But I want to stop here because we have few times, and I want to involve, if possible, your vision. You have your opinion about this. I want to pass the chair to Alessandro Cattara, that is going to ask you to on the table. Thanks.
Thank you, Davide. Thank you, everybody. Good evening. I have a list of people who are invited to talk tonight, this evening. The first one is Douglas MacLeod. You contributed to this second issue. I brought also the first issue, just in case you missed it. It's not for sale. It's my copy, but it's here if you wanna take a look. This is the second one, and you contributed, Douglas, with an essay about Göbekli Tepe. I've never been there, but I know Adolfo has been, actually several times. So if you want to join me here, and I guess you want to talk about it.
Sure.
Maybe no.
No, I'd be delighted to talk about it.
Great, that's
just
great.
Sort of explain what it's all about. And
I'll try to, if you want to, if you all want to put it in a sort of dialogic way. It's not an interview. I'm not giving a talk. It's not a presentation. It's a dialogue. So if you want to talk about your essay, and maybe Adolfo, you want to join in the conversation because you actually have an actual real experience of the place. Please, Douglas.
Okay.
Thank you.
thank you. I know you're recording. I can usually be heard very well without a microphone. In fact, people have suggested I can teleconference without a telephone, so I'll try and keep my voice down a little bit. But I wanted to explain to you why I think this is so incredibly important. So imagine in 1995, a German archaeologist, Klaus Schmidt, begins excavating in southern Turkey at this little place called Göbekli Tepe, which means pot-bellied hill in Turkish. And what he finds is this whole series of structures, not just one, but multiple structures. And the hallmark of these structures is these enormous T-shaped limestone monoliths, some of which weigh 16 tons and are 18 feet tall. And just for comparison, the inner circle of stones at Stonehenge, they're about 13 feet tall. And these monoliths, they're carved in both high relief and bas relief with spiders and scorpions and vultures and snakes and even stylized humans. And so all of this is very interesting, but what's most remarkable is their age. Now these things have been dated to the 11th millennium BCE, not the 11th century BCE, but the 11th millennium. In other words, they are 11,000 years old. So, put this in perspective. The pyramids of Egypt are closer to us than they are to Göbekli Tepe. They were built before we domesticated animals, before we planted crops. They were built by hunter-gatherers, and the archaeologists are even reluctant to call them temples because they're not really sure that we had religion in the sense that we understand it now. And because of this, it absolutely upends every theory we've had about the evolution of humans in that area. And in fact, the evidence would seem to suggest that it was architecture that was the catalyst for all of these things that came later, all of these hallmarks of civilization. It was so surprising that somebody actually said it was as if someone built a Boeing 747 in their basement using only an X-Acto knife. So here's why this thing has enormous implications. If you can get hundreds of people to work for month after month on building something like this, then it fundamentally changes the nature of the projects that you can undertake. So the planning, the program strategy, and the strategizing that are necessary to do this, it represents an absolutely unknown level of human executive function. We'd never seen anything like this before, because it's the first evidence we have of people forming a complex idea in their head, holding on to it, communicating it to others, getting the necessary technologies together, perhaps even inventing the necessary technologies. And it's the first example then of organizing groups, large groups of people to quarry, to move, and to erect these things. But even more than that, think of this idea. All of a sudden, people are manipulating the natural environment. They're manipulating in space, they're manipulating in time. We don't have any early evidence of this thing. And that makes it absolutely remarkable. So when we really, though, start to think about it, I use that Lucan quote, which is, thoughts exchanged by one and another are not the same in one room as in another. And if you believe that, what kind of extraordinary thoughts are possible in this absolutely new kind of space? And of course, you can imagine that those kinds of thoughts are things like, well, maybe we could also domesticate animals. Maybe we could build cities. Maybe we could create religion. In other words, these spaces are very fundamental to the way that our mental model of the world has evolved. And why I'm particularly interested is because I have the great privilege of leading Canada's first and only online school of architectural education. And every day, I'm watching my students create this new kind of space online. And what God only knows what kind of thoughts, new kinds of thoughts are emerging. But if we want to realize the potential of that space, then what we have to do is recognize and understand what was happening at Göbekli Tepe. And just before I stop, I would like to say I was very lucky, almost alone among archaeologists. Trevor Watkins, who's a Scottish archaeologist, he seemed to appreciate the power of architecture during that time. And he was very kind to have read my manuscript and made some very positive changes. So I would like to gratefully acknowledge his contribution, but also to thank everybody for inviting me here tonight. I'm very pleased to be here and to be part of what is a very, very beautiful publication. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. I think in a very brief way, you provided a sort of idea of what Bau culture at that time. It's quite it's a German world, and it's a quite recent world, especially when applied in English, in the English language, but still, you can you can give a meaning in a very particular and deep and profound meaning to this world and this word and this notion, even with such an ancient example.
Well, you have to actually believe that if Göbekli Tepe had this kind of impact on people, and it appears to have been, must have been a very powerful impact just because of the archaeological evidence. What happens then when we keep on reinventing new kinds of spaces? What happens when we start to look at the Gothic, for example, or the Renaissance, and think about, was there a feedback loop between the nature of these new spaces and the kind of ideas which were emerging at the time? And I suspect there probably was.
Of course. Thank you, Douglas. Maybe you want to join us later in the conversation. Suchi, Reddy, you're an architect, and you have your own practice,
Can you hear me?
awarded practice, and as far as I understand, it's based on this very human-centric idea of architecture, and there's this famous Louis Sullivan quote that form follows function, but you state that actually form follows feeling.
Yes.
And you were actually involved also with this master program in Venice, but then you didn't make it, maybe? You will?
Yeah.
The new edition just started. For those of you who don't know about it, it's a master degree that Davide founded. He is also the director of the course in Venice, and it's about neuroscience and architecture. So welcome.
Thank you.
You want to talk about your practice?
Sure.
What,
Well, first of
what
all, I
this-
just want to say I'm
yeah.
super happy to be here. It's an honor. And Davide, this is absolutely wonderful. There's so many luminaries in this room that, I'll start slowly. But yes, the idea that form follows feeling has been something that's been sort of a guiding mantra of my practice, which I've had for 17 years. And I've always looked at these ways in which, as an architect kind of building her practice, it's really become a bit troubling to me that we have seemed to have lost our agency to lots of different forces like culture or technology or developers or you name it, capital or technology. And I kept thinking about the way in which I relate to architecture and why that's actually meaningful, and these ideas of embodied architecture, of bringing it back to the human, because this is this democratic space that we can all relate to regardless of our cultural bias, our intellectual bias, any of those things. This is really where architecture starts. And this is where it should come from, and these are the ways in which we regain our agency in shaping the conversation of culture, because architecture is not just a vessel for culture, it's an agent, as Douglas was saying, and as Davide is making the argument, that I think it's really important for us to figure out how to use that and to really look at what kinds of technologies we have these days. Like the biggest advances in technology have been in neuroscience, they've been in these fields, and as architects we cannot avoid this, and we should not avoid this. And really we should be, as master collaborators and master editors, really claiming our right to look at all of these things and pulling them together to try and shape a vision, for our societies and for ourselves, even if they're personal work. So that's really kind of where the work comes from.
Great. You have this, as far as I understand, both maybe Indian and American culture, right?
Yes.
What does that mean? And I think, of course, it does.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I will say it's pretty much Indian culture. I am Indian. I've just lived here a very long time, since I was 18, and so I've adapted in the ways that immigrants adapt. So I also have this somewhat liminal perspective that shows me the difference between these two cultures and how I bring them together. So this is also something that I think about very much in
You still practice
work.
there, right?
I do, yes, yeah. And it is very interesting that we just did a project, in fact, that I worked on with Susan. And I had someone walk through the project and come back and tell me that they were looking at it through a socioeconomic lens. They were really looking at, do I feel worthy to be in this space? And that's something that people from my part of the world think about. It's not something that people in the West really use as their framework of judging spaces. And so these kinds of things are also important to the ways in which we work.
Of course, great. Do you want to, Susan, talk about this project? Or
Yes.
you want
I
to
can
talk about
switch,
it together?
sure,
Yeah.
Okay. Do you want to start? No? Go ahead.
Susan Magsamen, she is the director of the Arts+Mind Institute at Johns Hopkins University. You presented actually, I think, a couple of times at ANFA conference in San Diego, where many of us attended the conference in these last few years actually. The first one, I think it was 2012. 2003
they started, yeah.
Well, the annual conference, the main
yeah.
one, I mean. Yeah, but
Right.
it was founded, at least 10 years before, yeah. So you want to talk about this joint project you have, and then you want to talk about the Arts+Mind? Okay, great.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello. So the project that Suchi and I worked on was with Google, and we decided that we really wanted to create an exhibition that helped participants understand the neurobiology of space. So we developed a band that measured variable heart rate, also galvanic skin response, and respiration. And Suchi designed 3 rooms that used neuroaesthetic principles. And basically, that was really looking at sensory inputs, how we looked at light, smell, sound, touch, primarily. So each of the rooms had very different aesthetics. And very different vibrations. So you came into the first room, for example, and it really felt like a cave. The second room had LED lighting and was very angular, was very citrusy in terms of its smell. And then the third room I thought of as very primal, very transformative. You walked in and you really felt that you were in a transformative space. You smelled charcoal. It was very sort of warm, and in some ways very masculine, I thought. After you left those 3 rooms, we took the band and we were able to tell you of the 3 rooms where you felt most at ease based on the neurobiology. So what was interesting about that is 50% of the people that came through thought that they felt most at ease in a different space. Only 50% really were in touch with the biology of how they felt and what they were experiencing. And so what we were trying to show was that how we feel and how we think don't always connect, and that if we're really more in touch with our bodies and the way that we feel, we may be able to create spaces or move through spaces where we can achieve different kinds of outcomes. So let me stop there.
Okay, great. Is this a project you developed within the Arts+Mind Institute? Wait,
Yes.
You did?
Yes. Yeah. So our work is really looking at the intersection of the arts and brain research.
Yeah, sure.
And that includes architecture, but it also includes all of the other kinds of arts that you would think of, from digital arts through visual arts, writing, dance.
Great. We also have an essay about dance, about and a ballet from Sasha Valls. We have poetry in this journal because we believe that we want to enrich this definition of architecture through many different disciplines. And we think that, we'll try to do it, of course. Sure.
May I just say that in many indigenous cultures, and I love the piece that you wrote because we were talking about executive function and soft skills, there isn't a word for art because it's just what we do. And I think the more we get away from labels, the more we're going to be closer to the essence of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I totally agree with you. Thank you, Suchi. Professor Stephen Holl, you also attended ANFA conference in 2016. You gave a talk. I was there, and I really liked it. The way in San Diego, exactly, at the Salk Institute, which is also a beautiful place. You gave a talk, and I really appreciated the way you being there. And for those of you have been there, you know that it's also kind of very intense conference, and at some points it's also kind of hard to understand and follow all the arguments that are coming up. I think you gave a talk. Well, of course you have images like many other people, but also you explained your idea in a very accessible language, and I think it was very effective. The title of your talk was "Activating the Brain." Of course, couple of your projects are illustrated in this second issue of Intertwining, and we are very proud of that. Do you want to join us in this conversation about the intersection of neuroscience and architecture and the arts?
I could just say that talk I gave as a lecture
Sure.
in a number of places.
Mm-hmm.
Architecture Activating the Brain, I gave probably 4 places in Europe, in Copenhagen and at the ETH in Switzerland. And I asked the audience afterwards what they thought. You know, I also show my projects. And I was told by one group that I should just publish that as a pamphlet, because I was connecting to Eric Kandel and this whole business about abstraction and his recent book about how the brain needs abstraction because it works from the bottom up instead of from the top down. And when you give something literally to someone, they don't have that possibility. Anyway, I loved Eric Kandel's speech and we got back and forth. But when I was in Geneva, 2 architecture professors came up to me and said, no, you can't publish that theory of your, you know, whatever you're thinking about, independent of your projects. So basically, this is the new book.
Wow.
And in fact, I just gave Kenneth it just came out. I didn't even have it yet. I only have 5 copies.
We are also presenting a new book tonight.
Yeah. No, but it's a coincidence that you bring that talk up because the Architecture Activating the Brain is the thinking, and then there's the making. And so I have 18 projects in the book. And those professors said, because you're one of the only architects that it's building and, you know, and trying to think at the same time. And you have to put those things together because you can't publish just the thinking part. So that's a coincidence, you know, and I was interested to see, you know what this event was about. But this is also the sort of the result of that moment in 2016. I mean,
what's the title of the new book?
This is Compression.
Compression.
But the first half of it is called Thinking, and it's exactly that, you know, elaboration of that Architecture Activating the Brain. I'm not sure. I have to say I have my doubts. I don't really agree with the scientific approach 100%. I think the intuitive is more important, and you can't really measure it 100%. But what I was interested in, and with Ioanni Palasma especially, is that there is some interesting breakthroughs in neuroscience that could be giving some validity to architecture, how important it is, you know. And I actually start this book with the quote of Winston Churchill: first we shape our buildings and then they shape us. And Sanford Quinter, who's really an interesting writer, wrote an afterword in this book, which I think is pretty important.
That's very interesting. I think it's very interesting the what you just said, that you don't totally agree with this idea. I pursue.
I'm just skeptical. I'm just a
I
skeptic.
understand it, because I'm skeptical too. Even though I pursued my PhD in Parma with neuroscientists, well, at the Department of Architecture. I mean, I'm an architect, and my PhD was in architecture with this neuroscientist, Professor Vittorio Gallese, who was within the team that they discovered the mirror neurons, and all this enterprise actually, at least a good part of it, started from there in Parma and Milano those years, a few years ago. What I do believe is that very talented architects don't need it, don't really want to study and all these neuroscientific theories. They probably don't need it because they are very talented and they know it.
But if you're a
instinctively.
teacher,
is that what
Kenneth
you're
and
saying?
I teach, I think you do need to
As a teacher.
articulate
Yeah, of course.
what's at the base, what is the core aims.
Yeah.
And you can't do that without speaking,
Sure.
and making references. And I think Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology were my breakthrough moments in my life in 1984, right? And it's funny that your text is the text. I did this museum, which is 22 years old now. It's Chiasma. It was named after that chapter, the last chapter of Merleau-Ponty's important work. And in Helsinki, they don't have a CH as a K, so they made it a K. But it really, if you go to Helsinki, that museum is basically the last chapter of Merleau-Ponty. I mean, it's the it's chiasm. That was that was the key word. When you hand in a competition, it's anonymous, right?
Yeah.
So I put chiasm
And
the chiasm, and they had to change it to K, and they named the street, everything. So.
And you worked with Johanni Palsma.
Yes, he was the co-architect.
Uh-huh.
He saved my life.
Oh, wow.
They were kicking me out. An American in Helsinki. What the hell was that?
For those who weren't at the ANFA conference in 2016, you want to tell them what you learned from, even though you have this sort of skepticism about the theory, the neuroscientific discourse within the architectural discipline. What you learned from Eric Kandel?
I was very happy to be there because it was more than 50% of the audience were scientists, not architects. And I put this drawing, actually it's right here on the screen, and I said, these different aspects influence us. The environment influences the body. Of course, the body influences the brain. And I put a dotted line around what I call the mind. And I said, that's not influenceable, it's stochastic. And, this is basically the intuitive, the immeasurable, right? Anyway, he gave my whole talk, and at the end of it, there were some long questions and answers. And actually, the director of the Salk Institute said, that's precisely what we study, stochastic thinking. So I was kind of really, sort of, maybe it's the reason I kept working with this text, which is very raw in a way, because I'm not a scientist and I'm not a writer. And Kenneth has warned me that I have to watch out with my words. But that gave me the courage. I mean, in a way, because the scientists agree in some way agreed with it, and so I've written it, and I'll give it to architecture students, not scientists. Give it to architecture students, because where do they go today? What do they who's writing theoretical things? Not so many things, and they need something to chew on. And by the way, you don't find the word phenomenology in this book.
Oh.
That was another thing I wanted to do, because I can't just keep leaning on this one word, which Wittgenstein said doesn't have any meaning at all, and so that was another.
But maybe you want to give it to neuroscience students as well, to help them to better frame the questions they want to ask.
I was just going to add that I think there's a dialogue, right? It's intuition and learning are sisters.
Right.
So your learning and your intuition is changing and growing, and so science and art comes together
Right.
in a way that it dances, right? And so that's how I was at your talk, and I hear yeah, and I hear that your thinking has progressed since that talk, which is what you want, right? You don't want to just keep doing the same thing because you're not the same person.
Right.
So I think the dialogue between the disciplines is actually quite beautiful and important.
Absolutely. No, I mean, I continue to teach, so when I go to Columbia, I want to challenge myself and try to do something else. Because Kenneth is usually on the jury, and he blows the work apart, you know.
Sarah Goldhagen, you're an architecture critic, and you wrote a book that's titled "Welcome to Your World: How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives," which is actually a sort of a topic that you're trying to address and question with this journal. You want to talk to us about, yeah, please. You want to tell us what's your point of view about intertwining?
Sure. I should say, I think the real reason I'm here is because I was invited to contribute, and a dilatory author I sometimes am, and so I didn't. But I'm quite honored to be here, and so I read this very carefully, and of course know many of the people in the room and know their work. And I was trying to think what I could say that would sort of pull together and focus this, because of having edited a number of different publications. It's, you know, they go in lots and lots of different directions. And so here's what I came up with. There is a kind of paradigm shift going on in our understanding of how people actually experience built environments. And it's coming out of cognitive neuroscience and coming out of environmental psychology and various other places. And it picks up on intuition, artistic intuition, and so on. But, you know, one thing I have to say about intuition is that people love to celebrate intuition when it works. But there are a lot of times when it doesn't work. And that's where it can be useful to step back and to say, well, what do we actually know about how people experience environments? And that leads back to questions of cognition and perception. And the paradigm shift has happened around several different things. One of them, as already been mentioned, is sort of embodied or situated or enactive cognition. We now know that cognition is not a kind of top-down, as Eric Kandel would put it, process that starts with intellection and then moves down to decision-making and so on. It's something that's much messier and happens through a lot of schemas that we've developed by being embodied in certain environments and so on. So there's embodied cognition and perception on the one hand, and there's more information coming out about how we respond because we have evolved to be the beings that we are. So lots of information about our embeddedness in the environment and the things we need from nature, like natural light, and the kinds of effects that natural light have on us. And so the third kind of umbrella, these are big umbrella topics that we're not going to be able to talk about here, is that we know cognition and perception is multisensory and multimodal. So multisensory, multimodal, embodied, biophilic is the third category, and also a lot of most of this is non-conscious. It's pre-verbal experience. Okay, so that seems to me to be the thread that ties all these essays together, correct?
I think so.
Okay. Phew. I got it.
I think so.
And I think what's interesting to ask is, what does that change about how we understand architecture? What does it change about what we want from architecture? What does it change about our understanding of architecture and the built environment's role in people's health, well-being, cognition, learning, et cetera, et cetera? And my contention, anybody who's read my work knows, it changes a lot. It changes the historical questions that we ask, it changes the theoretical questions that we ask, and it changes the practical, meaning practice, questions that we ask. And I think this is, this volume is a really important contribution that shows the range of how those three simple facts that we now know that we didn't know 20 years ago are spreading out into knowledge, into historical knowledge, into theoretical knowledge and critical knowledge in lots of different ways. So that's my little speech.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you very much. I think you really framed, once again, the discourse. Professor Kenneth Frampton, there's a dialogue between you and David Ruzon in this journal, in this issue, and I happen to well, you also had a dialogue before the presentation tonight with Davide. Quite a long one, it seemed to me. You want to share it with us, with all of us?
The problem with people who write too much is that they can't remember what they wrote. Applies to me, but I can react to. I'm very happy to be here, by the way, and I just find it very instructive. Every speaker, in a sense, follows the next and amplifies the discourse in a very interesting way, I think. But one of the things I was thinking when Sarah was talking, this business of Walter Benjamin remarked that architecture is experienced mostly in the state of distraction, is what he said. And of course, one of the things that perhaps I should put it bluntly, obsesses me is the political chaos of this moment in time and the quite ruthless exploitation of people at many different levels. And one of the things that, I do think, phenomenology is important to me. Merleau-Ponty is important to me, but having said that, of course, have I really worked intensively on Merleau-Ponty? I can't claim that, And, but the issue of tactile versus the visual is a very big thing, I think. And of course, sort of things you could associate with the tactile, which is also acoustic, olfactory. And the thing, I think, which is the kind of challenge, is that we live in a society which has for a long time emphasized the visual and data and information, but above all the visual. So that, in a way, architecture schools have suffered from this, I think, because this question of the image. Not that the image is important, but, it becomes, in many schools, and of recent age anyway, the ultimate thing, the image. And I associate it with, the emphasis placed on the image. In this society, we are inundated with images, never ending. And it's a kind of programming, I think. Yeah. And it makes architecture quite difficult.
the Benjamin quote, you know, architecture is mostly appreciation of state of abstraction, seems to me to be, well, there are two sides to it, really. One is that it can lead to a kind of, what difference does it make, negative kind of way of looking at the whole thing, right? And on the other hand, of course, it is that perhaps it's also expressing the fact that, you know, it's a question of feeling and of tactile. In other words, I do believe that human beings are subliminally affected by architecture, you know, through, I'm sure that's the case, but not if they're heavily programmed, however, they're not open to it even. What I think the adaptability of the human being is the problem. It will put up, you know, in order to survive, it will put up with whatever, you know. And if the society is ruthless enough, of course, you know, there's a huge struggle to survive, you know. So for that sector of the society, you know, how can one begin? I mean, I think these issues do have to be taken into consideration.
Sure, of course. That's very. I think it's very important to distinguish the everyday experience, the very mundane experience of built environments, and the more aesthetic experience, the more conscious experience of an architectural built environment. Sure.
I just spontaneously want to say
Sure.
that I was Ken Frampton's student, and he was the one that introduced me to phenomenology when I was still in my 20s, and which has really formed the foundation of most of my writing. And so it's a way it sort of comes full circle here. So I appreciate that, and I wanted to.
I studied architectural history on Frampton's book in Italy, and all my friends did it as well.
Yeah, but he tormented me
in person. Yeah, of course. I got it. Yeah, I got it. And
I also want to say that.
Sure.
I was following Ken Frampton since 1977, like 42 years. And maybe every building I ever did, I always asked myself, what will Kenneth think? And probably more than any other person on the earth, he formed me as an architect. And unfortunately, I have a 3.5-year-old at home and I have to go home. I'm sorry.
The thing is, this is a very... It's a very practical example of a way that Bau culture is formed. Do we have any other suggestions, questions? Does anybody want to? Sure.
I'm not an architect. I'm curator. I look at architecture from a very different perspective. But
which one?
From a curatorial perspective. But I've looked very carefully at Stephen's architecture, especially, and I was on the chantier of the Queen's Library. And I told him that I never wanted to go to a finished building again after that, which was an interesting experience. But I think that one of the issues here is time, the element of time, and how going through a building, certain buildings, enable the person, the human being, to slow down. And I was at a meeting the other day talking about technology and development, and I said that I felt it was a curatorial obligation to address the issue of slow-looking, fast culture. And I feel that we're in this bind at this moment, in this extremely problematic political time. And I think that architects have an obligation to bring slowness, slow being to humanity in the best sense of the word, because this inundation of images, I think, is an element of fast to a point of distraction and real counterintuitive sense of life. So from an outsider's perspective into the architecture community, I am making a plea for this dimension.
I think the interesting thing about time, which is very, very personal perhaps, but I think you go to a building, because it has a reputation, and then time passes and you go to it like, I don't know what, 10 years later, and then more time passes and you go to another decade later. And I've noticed that one's experience of the building is not the same, and that one can have a kind of very positive first experience. And when you go the second time, somehow it is disappointing, I don't know, in whatever way. I mean, I speak for myself. And the third time, it emerges, more positively, I don't know. But the other thing I think about time is, of course, buildings themselves change in time, not only because the weather and because use changes and all these things, but also I think the overall climate of the time in which you are in, when you, like it has an effect on the work,
Of course. Oh. And in the most speculative part of my work with the neuroscientist Vittorio Gallese, we tried to address this the way that if a novelty experience becomes familiar, like let's say the place, your office, your the place you go the most, you happen to live in the most of the time, but still, of course, you had the first time there. The experience, your experience, gradually shifts from novelty to familiarity, and we believe it's because it's through embodied simulation. It physically shapes you, and so the more it goes on and on, you feel it less, because it physically shaped you. Sorry.
Would you say internalizing the building? So it becomes part of your...
Well...
So it becomes part of your inner world in a way?
Yeah, in a way, yeah. Like music or
What would you say you're
so,
habitually?
what?
Would you say you're habitually?
Yeah.
Sorry, but can also be only based on the idea of reducing the level of energy that you consume on your brain. So yes, I know, I do less.
Yeah, probably also as well. It's sort of collateral.
There's a beautiful Goldhagen story that where the hero enters the train, and then after some time, traveling long distance, he feels that the compartment he is in is not the same, you know. I found that such a, because I think sometimes one experiences something like that, you know, you enter something and you know, and then you because it's a train, let's say, you have to stay there in that position, in that space, and then, you know, somehow it sort of, in a very subliminal way, changes, you know, your perception of it changes, and it's amazing that story sort of just touches it.
And I think it's also amazing the way if you're attentive to yourself, you feel the way you changed over time, experiencing the places where you go. Maybe not the everyday places, but maybe the places where you go sometimes. And you happen to experience different things.
I once did a project. It's a private collection for chemists. And one of the themes was that they talked about was, and that's a lot of how their work works, as they explained it to me, is making the invisible visible. And obviously, graphically, they have found a way to explain this invisible. And I kept thinking a lot about that idea, because is this what I'm doing too as an architect? Am I making this invisible visible? And because I have tools, I have experience, I have a sense about things. So are these invisible things that I'm able to collect, that they themselves, as scientists, are able to get their brain to bring about, you know, their work.
Well, I try to say 2 words about some interesting suggestions I perceived, I grasped. I would like to come back to the idea to the relationship among environment and perception, because we were saying that the first time you see, an environment, you perceive the novelty of it, but you can adapt yourself to the situation, and so you can change after you assume a familiar approach to this environment, a second, a third, and so on. And we have to ask ourselves what means this, because I don't know if this is the approach of Vittorio Gallese you mentioned, but I want to remember that sometimes we must be able to adapt yourself to the environment. This is the reason for which Churchill said, you design a place, the place that design you design you. Not always in a positive way, because this is the reason for which we are so focused on the neuroscience, because if you start from the point of view that people inside maintain deeply rooted some needs, emotional needs, according the reason for which people is inside the building, because you don't have to forget that when we stay inside the building, we are making an experience for one reason, for many reasons, for inside one building. When you come back to home, you are waiting and emotionally to live a particular experience normally. Different respect when you go to the university to learn a lesson, or to go to the hospital to work, or to the office. So the kind of emotion you wait is very different. And so the combination, the relationship, the coupling among environment, atmosphere, you are going to produce as architect when you are designing a place for an hospital, for example, is obviously a different aspect when you are designing a place as an office to work. in which way? This is for which reason? Neuroscience can support the research of the needs of people. Obviously, it's not so directly able to produce easy receipt to make design, obviously. But anyway, we are studying some some mechanism that can attune better the awaited emotion of people with the dynamic perception of spaces. The dynamic perception, because the perception is always dynamic. And coming back to the point, if you think about the reaction that the prisoner inside the jail have to respond to the isolation, for example, because last time in Anfa in San Diego, I could Mudakil, I remember a neuroscientist from Philadelphia, if I remember correctly, bring with her the history of an isolation in 12 years in a jail, in a solitary system, a sort of a solitary system, and explain in which way the prisoner adapt himself to the condition of the space, reducing the dimension of the hippocampus dramatically, reducing the capacity to produce emotion and empathy with any other person. So, okay, we can adapt ourselves to the environment. At which price? We have to understand in which way we should ask to pay a price to people to stay inside a place that we decide to design in a determined way. And so we have to ask ourselves in which way neuroscience and human science generally can support us to understand which is the needs that we have to use as target to which tune our design, without asking to the human science to produce, very easy receipt to produce space, because they are not our target, sure, absolutely. But in this way, the capacity to live, our breath, to move and to fly also, if you want to say in this way, to grasp an intuition, to use the intuition, the stochastic approach is very important, because in that moment we are very able to create a bridge. Only in that way, without there's no other way, there's no receipt. There's only the jump. The last kilometers is a jump through that you can make only through the intuition, and the capacity that each one endowed with the task to design a place use to create the appropriate way to solve the human needs. This is my point of view. I think there's also this magazine that we developed is a very simple way to create an atmosphere, common atmosphere inside the community of thinkers, able to search new answers. This is all.
Sorry, do you want to conclude the evening? It's up to you, if you want to.
I don't really want to conclude the evening yet. I want to keep going.
You want to keep going?
But I guess we should round up. Does anyone have any more questions, or we have such a great group of people here? Oh, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It was a really interesting talk. I work in immigration law. My background is in international affairs and public policy, so I'm not an architect. But I was wondering if anyone can touch upon the need to, well, actually, this is the first time that I hear about the Bau culture idea, and I'm guessing it comes from the Bauhaus movement. But yeah, I was wondering if you can comment a little bit further on how our social and political context influences our lived and built spaces, especially in our present times when our climate is shifting so quickly, and the need to really address strategies for the survival of our species.
Well, the Bau culture it doesn't actually come from the Bauhaus. It comes from German, and it refers to a culture of building, a building culture that, well, in this context, comes from Switzerland, which they have certain privileges that other countries don't have, so they can afford to have an amazing building culture. But the way we used it was that architects are actually building culture implicitly in the work that we do. And so one of the reviews we have of the book in the journal is Harry Mulgrave's new book, who's an architectural historian, and his book is called From Object to Experience. And he uses this, he talks about culture in the sense of culturing a plant, that you would not grow a certain plant in another kind of climate where that plant didn't grow because it adapts through time. So culture has this, like the word agriculture comes from culture. That's the original meaning of culture. And so, I mean, these are large, vast questions, which I think, not that we can answer them or pretend to respond to something so grand, but the very, if we take it back to the body, which I always do, I mean, we could talk about embodiment, but it really comes down to our body and the needs of our body. A lot of these massive problems come from very simple, there are simple solutions to them. Like if you think about, if we modeled buildings on the body, the first thing we would think about is breathing. I mean, breathing. Do our buildings breathe? Do our buildings breathe? They don't breathe. Even the one of the major causes of global warming is refrigeration, air conditioning. So I bring it back to the body, but I'm sure other people have different views.
So I think I want to respond to that a little bit. We've been talking a lot about the building and people in the building, and I think what you're talking about is what do people need from their buildings, right? So we don't put people in cages, right? We don't, but we do. We are. So how could that be good for the body, right? So if you think about what do we value and what do we stand up to, I think in an immigration sense, we don't live best in cardboard boxes or on the streets, and we don't live best in shelters. So we live better when we're in a home community where we feel safe. You don't feel safe when you're surrounded by 25 people that you don't know and you're trying to sleep. So I think if we were turning problem solving and looking at what are those intractable problems and solving those through space, which I think architects do all the time. I think, the idea is how do you solve problems? So how do you solve for a room in a hospital where you need to have a certain kind of illness attended to? And I think the more we start to think about how do we solve human problems through space, that's where I think there's a conversation to be had. So.
Yeah, but I think, this question raises the political in a big way, and you can't really have a culture of architecture, strictly speaking, without a different political situation. I mean, it's just impossible, And what is going on right now? I mean, also the whole idea of solitary confinement, all of this is just barbarism. You know, we live in a barbaric society. I'm sorry, this is a very barbaric society, you know. And architecture is placed in this situation, in this contradiction, right? I think rather heavy.
I would argue that it's not Bauculture is not simply a historical issue or topic, but indeed it's something. At least this is what we aim to. Maybe it's not actually, but we aim to. We want it to become really actual and practical for today and tomorrow practice of architecture.
Could I just build on some of the things that have just been said, because I really like the concept of form following feeling, but I also think that we need to really think differently about the way that we design things. And one of the things that fascinated me was that people were used to, with technology and networks, they would talk about the last mile. And then somebody said maybe the most important part of that network, though, is the last inch, by which they meant what was going on inside the people who are using those technologies. But if you pause for a moment, then you think, well, maybe even more important is the first inch, which is what's ever going on in the mind of the designer. And what we often see is a complete disconnect between the first inch and the last inch. And yet there's so much, we're such babies when it really comes to understanding how do we actually interact with any of these spaces. There's so much more work to be done to determine, you know, you can read some of the studies about if you put a violent person in a room that's painted with what's called Baker Miller pink, in 10 minutes they'll calm down. But if you leave them in too long, they start to get heated up again. There's all these things that we just simply don't know. And we need to do so much more work to understand how this thing affects that thing. And it seems we're at the start. I mean, it's desperate now that we have to do something dramatic about the built environment because the world is basically on fire. And yet we have so much basic research to do at the same time. And but I appreciate that the journal makes a very important contribution to all of that.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. I would like to come back to all the talking about neuroscience, actually, and with a little caveat that I'm a really big fan of neuroscience. I think it's super interesting, but there's always this, so you were talking about embodied experience, but then about neuroscientific findings. What are your views on the concept of neuroreductionism? Because in the end, I mean, if you scan or if you track or trace, of course you're going to find some sort of movement in the brain. You're going to find some sort of movement. It's obvious, because if you wouldn't, the person would be dead. So how would you respond to the critique of neuroreductionism in general?
Thinking, it's really generative. And so we look at sociology, anthropology, cognitive neuroscience, psychology, psychiatry, public health, and it's a multimodal approach. And so it's not really only looking at a molecular or cellular level, but looking at it in a sort of larger ecosystem. And I think the conversation started by saying that this is messy. It's really messy, and it has to be messy. That's why I love your logo. It's really messy, and I think it has to be in order to be meaningful and to try to. I don't think we're going to have an answer. I think we're going to have lots of approaches because problems are complicated. So it's generative. I think architecture, the arts by nature, are many things more than one single mechanism. But the mechanisms are important to understand and how they work together. The brain works like an orchestra. So to understand to go deep in many things makes sense.
Really just to talk about
I totally
this idea
agree.
of intuition in architecture also, architecture is our way of understanding ourselves. It's our way of understanding our culture. It's our way of both making it and being in it and processing it and finding something new. That's not a simple or reductive or anything that can be reduced to I can find this amount of data and therefore replicate these conditions. This isn't really, and this is particularly the difference between the neuroscientists and the architects. And when we have these kinds of conversations, part of the problem is really finding a language that works, between two completely different ways of coming at understanding who humans are, what humans are, and how we function, right? So there isn't a simple answer to that. I mean, that actually, I think, I'd just throw it back at you and say, that's a way of thinking about things in a box. If you want to do that, you could.
You're getting a lot of answers. I'll add that, that's why I keep emphasizing a paradigm shift. The fundamental paradigm shift is that we can no longer conceptualize architecture as a stage on which we act out our lives. The stage shapes what we do. This has been said repeatedly, but we now know this to be true. It's not just something a friend of mine used to say, we used to sit around a table, she runs a nonprofit in New York, and say, design is important, but nobody could tell us why or how design is important. We now know that it fundamentally affects the way people feel, what people think, the structure by which they think, their physiological states, their well-being, and their health, okay? That's a shift. So to say, neuroreductionist, you're going to go too far in the scientific direction, we're not anywhere close to being too far in the scientific direction. And it's all messy, as both Susan and Suchi have said, but much more necessary than we ever thought it was. And just because there's going to be reductionism along the way doesn't mean that we're not obligated to try.
Okay. Thank you all very much.